Tomorrow will be the 40th anniversary of the conception of the first test tube baby, Louise Brown. The two men who made their names as IVF pioneers were Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. But Edwards did mention at one time that the work was done by a threesome, and the third member of that threesome was the embryologist Jean Purdy. So who was she, and how significant was her contribution to reproductive medicine? Dr. Sue Avery is Director of Birmingham Women's Fertility Centre and joins us from there. Dr. Gillian Lockwood is Medical Director at Midland Fertility and she joins us from Leeds. Gillian, how did you become aware of Jean Purdy's existence?
There was an article written by Roger Gosden who mentioned the significant contribution that she'd made to the creation of the world's first test tube baby. But also on occasions when I'd been speaking to Bob Edwards himself, he had mentioned how important her role had been in the project because she was so dedicated and supportive and encouraged them to keep going during the 10 years it took from the initiation of the project to the final successful delivery of Louise.
What did he tell you about the actual work that she did?
He didn't go into any great detail, but it's quite clear looking at the notebooks that she was intimately involved at all stages. It's her handwriting that comes all the way through the meticulous notes that were kept. So she was clearly involved all the way through. And interestingly, when she was not able to be part of the project because she was, for instance, caring for her mother during her terminal illness, then all work on IVF seems to have stopped.
So what did her name mean to you?
Well, I was fortunate to work at Bourne Hall and to work with Bob Edwards, and I was aware of she was almost legendary at Bourne, and Bob always talked about her as playing a major part, as being the person that pioneered the kind of attention to detail that clinical embryology relies on. So you need the creative minds to drive the science forward, but in order to make it work, you need the people in the background who are making up the culture fluid, who are making sure the conditions are perfect, and in Jean's case, also talking to the patients, trying to encourage them, having to wake them up in the middle of the night when they were collecting urine samples over 24 hours to check when they were going to produce eggs. And that's the kind of role she had.
What was her role in setting up Bourne Hall?
Well, in setting up Bourne Hall itself, she was the one who was sent out to look for a property because at the time Patrick Steptoe had retired from Oldham and they were Bob and Patrick were looking for somewhere to set up a clinic to take the work forward. And the health service wasn't interested, particularly given the controversial nature of the controversial way in which it was perceived at the time. So they needed to find somewhere, and Jean found Bourne Hall, which is in many ways now you would think the most unsuitable place to try and set up a clinic. But it's a beautiful Jacobean manor house, and it worked.
She trained Gillian as a nurse. So how did she actually become an embryologist?
Well, the profession of embryologist didn't really exist then, but no, after her initial training in Cambridge, she was briefly in Southampton, but was quite homesick and came back to Cambridge and applied for a vacancy as a technician, a research assistant really, with Bob Edwards, and he was just embarking on the work at that time, and her skills in nursing not only, as Sue has said, made her enormously effective with the patients, highly sympathetic, highly supportive, but also the things that are vital in embryology, like close attention to detail, keeping everything perfectly sterile. These all came naturally to her as a trained nurse.
So you mentioned that the work was controversial at the time. Just remind us of how controversial it was.
Well, there was a huge amount of there's a balance between excitement from parts of the scientific community, criticism from parts of the medical and scientific community, fear, I think, in some quarters. The church, different elements of the church were disapproving, confused, and some downright angry and very critical. And in Parliament, there were efforts made to ban IVF. Enoch Powell was very much involved in trying to, at the very least, limit the possibilities for IVF.
Gillian, why do you suppose she did not get the credit that she deserved at the time?
I think with hindsight, it's the same problem that Rosalind Franklin suffered from, that she died too young. Steptoe and Edwards themselves were always very keen by making sure that she was a co-author on most of the significant early papers that they wrote about IVF. So they were very keen to promote her as being one of the three pioneers. And at a meeting 20 years ago to celebrate the first 20 years of IVF, he said that, she'd been an absolutely vital part of the process.
As you said, she died when she was only 39, but she is to be remembered next year with a memorial at Grantchester where she's buried. How important is it that she now gets recognition, Gillian?
I think it's vital that the role that women have played in science is recognised and celebrated, because it's the only way that we're going to encourage young women to see the scientific subjects, the STEM subjects, as being a place for them. I think it's quite interesting now that embryologists, about probably 75% of them, are actually female. And I think that's because the patient and meticulous and nurturing of the embryos, which is an essential part of the embryologist's job, is something that appeals to women, and they're very good at it.
Dr. Gillian Lockwood, Dr. Sue Avery, thank you both very much indeed